With the establishment of South Korea and North Korea, two nations now exist side by side on the Korean Peninsula. Both sides came to claim to be the legitimate government of the Korean Peninsula. Moreover, neither Syngman Rhee of South Korea nor Kim Il-sung of North Korea had given up on the unification of the Korean Peninsula. Syngman Rhee advocated for the northward unification, while Kim Il-sung continued to advocate the territorial integrity. Both sides publicly declared their intention to use force to destroy or subjugate the other. However, once the new nations of South Korea and North Korea were established, the United States and the Soviet Union each withdrew their main forces from the Korean Peninsula. At that time, South Korea and North Korea did not have the military power alone to force the other side to surrender. Therefore, both countries sought to unify the Korean Peninsula with the recognition and assistance of the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively. The United States feared that providing large-scale military aid to South Korea might lead to an attack on the north, so it did not provide South Korea with heavy equipment such as tanks or airplanes. Meanwhile, when the Soviet Union withdrew from the Korean Peninsula, it transferred large amounts of military supplies and equipment to North Korea. But Stalin feared war with America. Stalin did not approve Kim Il-sung's attack on South Korea because it could lead to American intervention on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea continued to purchase weapons, tanks, aircraft, and ammunition from the Soviet Union, and continued to strengthen its military. As the United States and the Soviet Union withdrew their main forces from the Korean Peninsula, the armies of North and South Korea faced off directly at the 38th parallel. As a result, conflicts between the armies of North and South Korea became more frequent along the border. These small-scale clashes mainly involved crossing borders to steal rice and food, and fighting over high ground. However, it seems that the North Korean military also aimed to gauge the strength of the South Korean military. Through these clashes, North Korea has concluded that its military equipment is superior to that of the South Korean military and that its training is also more sophisticated. Meanwhile, the Chinese Civil War ended and the People's Republic of China was established. Naturally, this incident provided a strong stimulus to North Korea's leaders. When the Communist Party expelled Chiang Kai-shek, calls arose in North Korea for Syngman Rhee to be expelled as well, further increasing the need for the unification of the Korean Peninsula. However, even at this point, Stalin had not given Kim Il-sung permission to invade the South. However, three important events occurred in succession that dramatically changed the situation. These were the successful nuclear test, the Atchison Speech, and the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. These three events marked a turning point, and the Soviet Union gradually leaned toward accepting North Korea's invasion of the South. Now let's take a look at the contents one by one. The first was the successful nuclear test by the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union used spies to obtain information from the United States while developing the atomic bomb. Finally, the Soviet Union successfully conducted its first nuclear test. This ended America's nuclear monopoly. Therefore, Stalin of the Soviet Union became confident that the Soviet Union could compete with the United States. Meanwhile, in the United States, anxiety spread among defense officials and scientists about the balance of military power between the United States and the Soviet Union. As a result, debate began within and outside the US government about whether to develop a more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb. Hydrogen bomb, also known as thermonuclear weapons, are a new type of weapon with far greater destructive power than atomic bombs. Ultimately, President Truman decided to go ahead with the development. The second is the Atchison Speech. Around this time, U.S. Secretary of State Atchison gave a speech on Asian policy. The speech expressed the idea that an archipelago war stretching from the Aleutian Islands through Okinawa in Japan to the Philippines is crucial to American security. However, the problem was that this defense line description did not include South Korea and Taiwan. Therefore, the Soviet Union thought that if North Korea invaded the South, the United States would not intervene. The third is the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance. This treaty was signed between China and the Soviet Union and guaranteed the prevention of aggression by Japan and any country allied with Japan in some way, namely the United States. The treaty provided that China and the Soviet Union would assist each other against such aggression. In response to this global situation, the Soviet Union believed that the power of the Eastern Bloc countries was increasing. These three important events led Stalin to believe that the United States would not intervene if North Korea invaded the South. The Soviet Union then began supporting the People's Republic of China on the United Nations Security Council. The Soviet Union then began to insist on excluding the Republic of China from the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member and instead recognizing the People's Republic of China as its representative. However, this proposal drew opposition from the United States and was not accepted. The Soviet Union therefore boycotted the Security Council's activities. Furthermore, the Soviet Union allowed Kim Il-sung to attack South Korea on the condition that he obtained China's approval, and decided to provide aid to North Korea. Kim Il-sung finally succeeded in gaining the recognition of the Soviet Union. The only remaining condition for North Korea was to obtain the approval of China's Mao Zedong. So Kim Il-sung went to Beijing and met with Mao Zedong. At this time, Mao Zedong wanted to prioritize military action against Taiwan. However, he ultimately agreed with North Korea's plan to invade the South and showed a willingness to support it. Having thus gained recognition from the Soviet Union and China, North Korea began full-scale preparations for an invasion of the South. North Korea asked a military advisory group from the Soviet Union to draw up a plan for an invasion of the South. The plan was created at the initiative of the Soviet Union military and then translated by the North Korean military. The first step of this plan was for the North Korean army to break through the South Korean defense line and destroy its main force. Specifically, the North Korean army was to occupy Seoul as quickly as possible and advance as far as the Suwon, Wonju, and Samchik lines. If this step was successful, it was expected that rebel forces within South Korea would take action and South Korea would collapse from within. In the second phase, the North Korean military will further its attack and crush South Korean reserve forces. The target areas for expansion were the Gunsan, Daegu, and Pohang lines. In the third phase, North Korean forces would wipe out the remaining South Korean forces and unify the entire Korean peninsula. The most important point of this plan was that the success of the first phase, which was to destroy the main South Korean military forces before the North Korean army could occupy Seoul, held the key to everything. Under this plan, the North Korean military deployed troops near the 38th parallel under the pretext of military tactical training. Meanwhile, South Korea was holding its second general election. In this election, the ruling party led by Syngman suffered a major defeat, greatly shaking the foundation of the government. At that time, South Korea adopted an indirect presidential election in which the National Assembly chose the president. Therefore, the ruling party's disadvantage in the National Assembly meant that it was more likely that Syngman would not be elected in the next presidential election. Syngman had to do something about the situation. In response to this situation, he wanted to change the presidential election from an indirect presidential election to a direct election by the people. The North Korean military ordered military tactical training at a time when the situation in South Korea was unstable, which temporarily put the South Korean military on alert level. However, after about 2 weeks, the alert was lifted and many troops were allowed to go out and take leave. At that time in South Korea, there was a strong feeling that the North Korean army would not attack, and people were living in peace. However, on June 25, 1950, under these circumstances, North Korean forces finally crossed the 38th parallel north and began their invasion of South Korea. The Korean War broke out.